Greetings and welcome to part 2 of Fire Jump. My name is Aaron Craig with Let's Learn This Together, and today we're going to be tackling adding in states for our player, spawning and being able to rescue civilians, adding in a score, and a cool jump effect when we move from window to window. So this is part 2. If you are just watching this video, make sure you go back and watch part 1. I show you where to grab the assets, and we're going to build on what we made in that first part. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive in. So the first thing we're going to do is add in a few more sprites for our player. So right now we only have the player going up into the air, but we want to add a few more sprites for when they are falling, when they are jumping, and then we'll also get eventually to when they hit fire and we kind of kill them because, well, you're not supposed to touch fire in real life or in games most of the time. So I'm going to click on this player group, and then I'm actually going to come up here and click create asset, and I want 2 sprites. I'm going to type 2 down here and press sprite and create, and it makes them both right there in our group. So on the first one, I'm going to go to import, and in the Fire Jump user assets, get art assets, go to character, whichever one you're using, and we're going to grab SPR player jump. And then we're also going to go into sprite 6 that we've got here, press import and grab SPR player fall. Now we've got both of these, but remember that when we're bringing in new sprites, we want to make sure that the origin is the same on them. And for our player, we want the origin to be middle center on all of these. So I'm going to middle center on this one and on this one. Now, if you're bringing in a lot of sprites, it might be helpful to know that you can actually change the default that the origin gets set to. If you go to File, Preferences, you can go to the Sprite Editor, and right here, you have the default sprite origin. So right now it's set to top left, but we could change it to middle center, press apply, and now whenever we bring in a new sprite, it's going to automatically be in the middle center. This is my preferred spot because most of my sprites end up being in the middle center, so it just saves a little bit of time. And that way, if I forget to do it, well, it's already done because I already changed it in the settings. Now let's rename these sprites before we forget. So this is going to be SPR underscore player underscore jump, and this one is going to be fall. So SPR underscore player underscore fall. So this one we're going to do when we're going down, and this one is going to be when we actually land on a windowsill, a ledge, and we're going to jump up. Now, we actually want this to play for a certain amount of time, and how we're going to do that is we can take the frame down here, and we can actually stretch this. So we can take one sub image here and actually make it multiple frames. So we're going to make this 8 frames altogether. And what that's going to allow us to do is when we switch to this sprite, it will stay there for 8 frames, which is pretty short, but definitely long enough to be able to see in your game. And then it's going to switch right back at the end of its animation. So it doesn't look like it's animated, but you can see that it's playing through all of them right here. So it is an animation, even though it's kind of a still animation. And then the frame speed for the fall doesn't matter because it's not an animation at all. There's just 1 frame on that. So now that we've got all the sprites we need for right now, we can set up the jump state. So let's go into OBJ player, objects, player, and we're going to go into the collision event with the window. I'm going to press F12 to give me a little more working space. I'm going to open this up a little bit. So right now we have an if check to see if we are going down. So if our V speed is greater than 0, which means we're moving down, and we collide with the window, then we actually get bumped up. But we want to add a little bit to this. We actually want to set the jumping sprite when we collide with this window. So we're going to go and look for set sprite. So I'm going to search for set sprite. And then we just drag this little Pac-Man down here and make sure it's underneath this if variable. And what we want to change it to is the sprite we just set up. So we can actually click on this select an asset, go to sprites, player, and we want player jump. And the frame is which one we start at, and we want to start at the beginning. So now when we collide with that window, we're going to change to this sprite. But before we test it out, we need to have a way to be able to move in and out of this jumping state that we're creating, because currently if we hit a window, we will just stay like that forever. So what we're going to check for is the end of the animation of our player jump. So I'm going to go to Add Event. We're going to go under Other, which has some really great events that cover things that you'll need in your game, like going outside of a room or intersecting a boundary, or when a game starts, when a room ends. The thing we're going to use right now is the animation end event. So this gets run when any animation for this object finishes playing. That means that when this event runs, we've reached the end of the animation and we know we want to switch back to our firefighter going up into the air. But we do want to be careful because we will have other animations that will be playing through this object, and we have other sprites. So we're going to add an if check here, if variable, and the variable we're going to check is called sprite underscore index, and it's a built-in variable, and we're going to check to see if we are on our jumping sprite. So SPR underscore player. And you can see the sprites even autofill in here, which is really, really handy. So jump is what we're looking for. So if the animation ends and our player is using the jump sprite, then we're going to change that sprite using that same code block we used before for setting sprite. So we'll drag it down here. We got to make sure that it's actually underneath our if variable here. And we want to change it back to our SPR player air. We can set it to frame 0, and it does not need to be relative. And voila! Now we can switch between these sprites exactly as you would expect. So let's go ahead and run it and check it out. So that's what we're looking for. If you want the animation to be shorter or longer, you can increase that frame size. And if you don't like it, then you can take it out, because remember, it's your game. You can do whatever you want with it. But that takes care of changing between the sprites that we've got. And that's a tool you're going to use very often, because one object will oftentimes have many sprites associated with it. And depending on what kind of game you're making, you could even have dozens of different sprites associated. Like an item object could have any of the item sprites that you could have in your entire game. So knowing how to switch between them and knowing how to check which sprite is currently attached to that object are really useful skills that you will continue to use in all of your games. Next up is the fall state. So now we want to tackle when we're going down. So we've got a change for when we're going up, but now we want to use that SPR player fall sprite when our v-speed becomes greater than 0. And how we're going to handle transitioning into this is by adding another event. This time go to step, and we're going to go to end step. So as its name suggests, the end step triggers after the step event. So that means that everything inside of here runs first, and then the end step code will get run, which is exactly what we're looking for, because we want to transition only at the very end if everything else is how it should be. So we're going to grab an if variable. This is one that we're going to continue to use over and over because of how powerful and useful it is. So we know how to check when our player is going down. We look at the v-speed, and we check to see if it is greater than 0. And if it is, we're going to set this sprite, and we're going to set it so we can type it in here if we know the name, which we do. So SPR player fall. And the frame starts at 0, just like how we want. So let's go ahead and test this, because it's everything we actually need to do to have all of our jumping states work. So you see that? We are jumping up, we're falling down, everything is working exactly as you would expect right there. So the way that it functions is when we collide with this window, most of our code gets run. The end step triggers all the time, but the collision event with the window sets it to the jumping sprite, and then right after that's done, it goes into the air sprite, and then at the end step, if we are falling down, it transitions to the falling sprite. 3 different states for 3 different sprites, and it works perfectly. Now, one very important thing to note is that when you're changing sprites, the mask for your character or your object is also going to change. So that means that when we changed our player air collision mask to right down here, that is how we want it when we are playing the game. We want this to basically be the same for the entire gameplay. But as soon as we switch to, let's say, SPR player jump or fall, that collision mask is going to get changed to this one. Or in the case of fall, it gets changed to this one. That causes some serious issues because this is not the same size mask, it is not in the same place, so it can make your game do unexpected things. Fortunately, we don't actually need to change the mask for all of these. We can go into OBJ player, and the collision mask right now is set to the same as Sprite, but we're going to actually change it to the player SPR player air. So that one custom collision mask we created is now the collision mask that will get used all the time for our player. This is something that is really easy to overlook, but when you are using multiple sprites and you are checking collisions, be sure that they either all have the same collision mask or you set a collision mask for that object to always be the same. This can cause so many problems when you are checking to see if you are colliding with something when you don't think you should be. So keep that in mind. Collision mask, you can set it manually right here. So next up, we're going to tackle spawning in the civilians. So down here in Sprites, let's go ahead and right click and make a new group. This one is going to be for civilians. And now we've got 3 different civilians that we're going to use. So I know we need 3 sprites. So I'm going to click on create asset, set it to 3, choose sprite, click create. And then I'm going to bring over the assets that we've got here. Now, when a new sprite is created in GameMaker, the default size for it is 64 by 64. So if we were to drag one of these images, which is much higher resolution, onto the sprite editor, well, it depends on where you put it, you're going to have a different action. So if you put it down here, it's going to actually want you to resize the sprite you're bringing in. So you can scale the image or the canvas, but either way, it's not going to be what you're looking for. You click apply, and now all of a sudden this is really low resolution. You can still kind of tell what it is, which is pretty impressive, but it's certainly not what we want. So I'm going to click on this and delete it. And then instead, when we drag a higher resolution sprite into our game, you want to put it up here, and then GameMaker will automatically resize it and have it fit properly. Then we can grab the second animation and drag it down here, and now it is inside here just the way we're looking for. Now this animation is way too fast at 30 frames per second. So we're going to set it to 4, and I think that looks pretty good. And we're going to rename this to SPR Civilian 0. And then let's go ahead and do the same for the other 2. So scroll down, not in the sprite, but down in GameMaker just a little bit. I'm going to grab Civilian 1A, put it in here, and then 1B, and we'll do the same for 2, and then we'll rename them and change the speeds. There we go. We also have the rescued sprites, which we'll use in a little bit, but for now I'll put them away. Let's go ahead and rename these SPR Civilian 1, change the FPS to 4, change this one to SPR Civilian 2, and change its FPS to 4. Now we have them named correctly in the right group at the right speed. So now we've got the civilian sprites that we're going to need, but we don't actually want the origins of these sprites to be in the middle center. Remember that the SPR window, we set its origin to be right there in the center. So what we're going to do is actually spawn our civilians right on this origin. But that means that for the civilians, we don't want them to be spawned in the middle of their image here. We actually want it to be bottom center, so right down here. So we're going to change it to bottom center for each one of our sprites. And now, when we create those objects in the game, they will be put exactly where they're supposed to be. Now, they have a little bit of a transparency down here and they kind of fade in, and that's because there's going to be flames in the window. So you can imagine right here, this is what it's going to look like. We're going to put that civilian inside the window just right there. So with all that out of the way, now we can create our civilian object. And you might think to yourself, well, I've got 3 civilian sprites, so I'm going to make 3 civilian objects. But as we saw earlier, you don't need to have a unique object for all of the different sprites you want associated with it. We can actually create one object for all 3 civilians because we're going to have them basically act the same. So this would be the idea of a parent, which we used in the last part, except now it's just one object, so we don't actually have to have them have a relationship like that. We are going to have them have a parent for the move parent so that they do act like everything else in the game, but we only need one object. So let's create object. We're going to name it obj civilian. And you can give it a sprite. So I'm going to give it the first sprite we've got here. And it's not going to matter too much because we're actually going to change that sprite randomly when we create this civilian in the game. But for now, it helps to have a sprite on it so you can easily see it over here in the asset browser. Now let's click on parent and choose obj move parent so that all the logic we have in that then gets translated to this object. So in here, let's add a new event, and we're going to add the create event. And we're going to search for a code block called choose. And this is a random code block in that you're going to get a different number every time you call this. And what this does is it's just going to choose from the options that you have available and return one of those. So we want SPR civilian 0. And if we need more options, we can click this little plus right up here. We want SPR civilian 1. And then one more option for civilian 2. So SPR civilian 2. And the target, what we're going to do with this is actually the sprite index. So what this system does is it's going to choose one of these 3 sprites and assign it to the sprite index of this object. And that's all we have to do there. So this is really little, but really powerful. We're going to get a different civilian sprite every time we make an object. Now the civilians here are going to act a little bit different than the windows. Currently, when our windows go outside of the room, we just then move them back up to the top. But for civilians, because we have this create code, we have to actually destroy them when they leave the room, when they get too low, and then create them again. So we're going to add a step event inside of here, and we're going to check to see if we are outside of the room. So we're going to grab the if variable, and we're going to check the Y position of our civilian. And if it is greater than room height plus 350, we want to destroy it. So under here in instances, we can destroy an instance. And we don't need to add anything to it because we're just going to destroy ourselves. The next thing we're going to tackle is getting the civilians spawning inside of the room. But when we create them, we actually need them to be on a specific layer. We want them to be between the player and the window. And we want to make sure that they're never on top of or below either of those because otherwise it's going to look really, really weird. So inside of our room, we're going to add another layer here. And it's going to be another instances layer. And this one we're going to name spawns. So this is going to be for anything that we're spawning, such as the civilians in the windows and the civilians when they jump outside of the windows when they are rescued. So make sure it's in between these, and you'll have some layering and depth issues if you don't. Now, let's open up obj window, because inside here we have a step event already. So what we're going to do is add on to this if variable to see if we should spawn a civilian when it gets moved to the top. So down here we're going to do another get random number, and we're going to put it just down here, so it's going to be linked right there, and it's going to be another integer, and right now we're just going to do 0 and 1. Later on, we will add more for more options, and you can change how often a civilian gets spawned, but for now we're just going to have 2 options. We're going to create a temporary variable called chance, and we're going to reference this as we get further down. But we are going to use a new code block here, and this one is going to be called the switch. Now, a switch is kind of like an if statement, but it's a lot easier to read and to have many different cases instead of just whether it's true or not. So let's grab this switch and we're going to put it down here, all inside this if variable. And this switch, we're going to have it be based on the value of chance. And then for a switch case, we need to grab the case structure, place it in here, and now you can see that we have lots of layers to this. And if you want to move around like I'm doing, you can middle mouse button click, and then you can move around like this. And so we've got a switch statement at the bottom based on the chance, which right now can be a 0 or a 1. So we're going to check to see each of those different cases. If it is a 0, then we're going to create that civilian. So I'm going to search for create, and it's going to be under instances. And we're going to drag it onto the side here. So we want to make a civilian. So I'm going to click on this, choose assets, go to objects, obj civilian, and we're going to do relative x and y based on the window that we're spawning it on. So our Windows origin is on that windowsill, and we're going to make it at x and y, which is the origin. So we're going to create it here, but if it's not relative, then it would actually get made at 0x and 0y inside of our room, which would be way up here, and that's not at all what we want. So make sure relative is checked, and the layer here has to be spawns. Make sure it's spelled correctly, otherwise you're going to get an error and it will not work. So with that, now it is going to create a civilian on the window when the 0 gets chosen of the random number here. We can fill out more cases as we go along, but for now we don't need to worry about that simply because if it chooses a 1, then nothing is going to happen. What's cool about a switch is you can have as many cases as you want, and you can also have what's called a default case, which means that it will get chosen if nothing else is found to be the correct case. But that's kind of besides the point, just something to keep in mind. Switches are great when you have lots and lots of different options and you want each one to do something specific. And now we are almost ready to test this out, but before we do that, we need to actually change which window we're looking at. So if we go to our sprites, you'll remember that we've got 3 frames inside of here and they're not animated. Instead, we want to select one of them for whenever we choose a civilian. Now, we don't want the first one, we want the second one. Now, what's confusing about it is that GameMaker starts counting at 0 for many different things, including the sub-images or frames that we have here. So you can see that the 0F stands for the 0th frame. And this window, the second one, is actually the first frame when you're counting starting at 0. And that's something important to keep in mind. So let's go back to obj window. And under create instance here, we're going to set that sprite that we want. So here, the Pac-Man, we're going to grab. Under here, we're going to set sprite to SPR, and it's going to be window, but the frame is going to be 1. So we want to make sure that it's on the second frame, which is actually the first frame because we start at 0. Now, let's run our game and check this out. So we should now have random civilians inside of here. And there they are. They move down with us. They are animated. They're in the flames. That is perfect. But we have one small issue where you kind of just saw it. That window has no one in it, but it has a flame. And that's because we're not resetting the actual window sprite back to 0. We're going to grab the set sprite right before the switch case, and we're going to choose the SPR window, and we're going to make sure it's on frame 0. So now, when it goes through and the window moves back up to the top, it will change back to the first sprite, the first frame, and it won't have any empty flames. There we go. So that fixes all of that, and you can see that it runs really smooth. This is coming along really, really well. We've got an infinite game that we can play here. We've got civilians, we've got them all moving, we've got parents. So far, you've already learned a tremendous amount just in these two parts, but we're not even done yet, and there's still a lot more to do. And now we're going to set up the system to be able to rescue our civilians. So in the civilians group, I'm going to create 3 new sprites. And at the top, I'm going to click on import, and I'm going to find civilian rescued 0, bring it in, and we're going to rename this to SPR civilian rescued 0. And I'm going to do the same thing for the next 2. Import civilian rescued 1. And civilian rescued 2. So this is what we're going to have the civilians switch to when we rescue them. Where they get these parachutes from, well, I guess we're just carrying a lot on us. But one thing we do need to change is from middle center or top left to bottom center. So all of the civilians are going to have bottom center origins. Otherwise, they're going to warp around and it's going to look really, really weird. So make sure you change those origins to match. Now let's open up the OBJ civilian object, and in the create event we're actually going to make our own variable. So we're going to look for a sign, and this is called a sign variable. Now the name of it is, we're going to set this to rescued, and we can put any name we want in here. You can't reuse the built-in variable names, those are off limits. But everything else is pretty much up for game. And what we're doing here is creating a variable specifically called a Boolean, which is either going to be true or false. That's all that is. It just is a way for us to be able to check at any time if we have rescued this civilian or not. It's information that we need to know, and there's no way that GameMaker has it built in for us. So instead, we need to put this inside of here so that we know if we have rescued them. And we can check this anytime we need to. For the value, we're going to set it equal to false. So it can be false or true. When we rescue them, we'll set it to true. So let's create a new event for the civilian, and it's going to be under collision, and we're going to collide with the player. So we're going to check to see when we're colliding with them, just like how the player collides with the windows and moves them down. Now we're going to have the civilian check to see if we are colliding with the player, because if we are, then they are rescued. So we're going to add the if statement inside of here. So right here, if variable, and we're going to check rescued. What we did in the create event was make this variable that we can check anywhere in any of the code for our OBJ civilian, which is why we made that in the create event. So if rescued is equal to false, so we haven't saved them yet, then we are going to assign a new variable here, right under common, right there. We're going to assign a new variable, and we're assigning rescued, so we're going to change it, and we're going to change it to true. And this system allows the civilian to only be rescued once, because we might collide with them multiple times, but we don't have to worry about it because this is only ever going to trigger when it's false. And as soon as it triggers, it sets it to true. So it only happens one time. Now, for the rest of this, we need to take that civilian, move it up, change the sprite, and then have it fall back down to Earth. So let's start by setting the speed. So right up here, we can set speed underneath after assigning the variable. We want to do the vertical speed, and it's going to be -18. So we're going to have them kind of jump up like the player does. But then we're going to set the gravity force. So inside here, we're going to set gravity for this object, and it's going to be at 0.5. So they're going to go up a little bit, then they're going to start coming down. Now the question is, how do we know which sprite to assign? Well, we can use another switch statement. So search for switch, drag it right down here, and then we're going to have 3 different cases. So I'm going to go ahead and grab these 3 cases right here. And the cases that we have are the different sprites that this OBJ civilian could be. So what we want to check is our sprite index. And the first one we're going to check is SPR civilian underscore 0. Then we have SPR civilian underscore 1. And the last one that it could be is SPR civilian underscore 2. So these are the 3 different sprites that this object can be. And if it's the first one, or I guess the 0 with 1, then we're going to change it to the proper sprite of that civilian floating down with their parachute. So now we're going to set a sprite here. So I'm going to drag this in for each one of these as well. And we already know which sprite it should be, so we can just choose right here. So for civilian 0, we want civilian rescued 0. For civilian 1, civilian rescued 1. And civilian 2, same thing. And there we go. Using that, we can now rescue our civilians. So let's run the game and test it out. I think you'll see that this small little change is going to suddenly make the game much more interesting and fun to play. There we go. We can now rescue civilians, they change, and everything is working exactly as you would expect, which is really, really cool. So one thing that you may notice is that when we rescue those civilians, they actually pop out and we are in front of them. And that's fine, but it might be better if the civilians are actually in front of us to show that they are clearly rescued, coming down, and that we're not covering them up at all. And the way we've been doing that up until this point is by having different layers, but we don't need to make a new layer specifically for this. Instead, we can control the depth. So every layer has a depth built in, and each layer you can check the depth of that layer. So the background has a depth of 300, and it goes up by 100 for each layer. So you can see the depth of all of these. So a less depth is closer to the screen than, so when it's being looked at, that's the thing you see first. So what we can do is actually change the depth of the civilian that we've just rescued. And we're going to want to do this with all of them. So what we're going to do is place a new block right up here before the switch. And this block is going to be the set instance variable. So we're going to drag this up here above the switch. And what we're going to change is the depth. And what we're going to change it to is our OBJ player. And then we're going to put a period, which allows us to access the built-in variables and data about our player, dot depth, and it's going to be -10. So whatever depth our player is at, we're going to move this civilian 10 closer to the screen. So if we run this, it'll be the easiest way to understand it. Every single layer has a depth and it's stacked on top of one another. So now when we rescue them, they are in front of us. So by accessing the depth of our player and then moving the civilian 10 less, it actually moves it closer to the screen. And I think that looks really great. But again, your game, you're customizing here. If you don't like it, feel free to change it and make it exactly how you think looks best. So as we're going through rescuing civilians, what we need to have is a score system. So we're going to add a little bit of a HUD so that we can see how many we've rescued and how we're doing in the game. We're also going to keep track of the high score as it's being played so that you can continually challenge yourself to do better and better. For this, we're going to need a few sprites, and we're going to add a new group first. So I'm going to go create group, and this one I'm going to be called HUD, H-U-D. HUD stands for Heads Up Display, and you've seen it in probably every single game you've played for a very long time now. Almost every game has a HUD because it's a way of giving you information about your items, your character, your location, your weapons, your score, whatever the case is. That's what a HUD does, and this is part of the UI, the user interface, that everything you see. And what we're going to do is add a HUD to our game, which shows us the score that we currently have. So right click, I'm going to create a sprite, and I'm going to go to import, and we're going to jump out of the civilians, and we're going to go to the UI folder, and what we're going to grab is the scorecard. So I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to rename this to SPR scorecard. And make sure your origin is in the middle center. That's where we need it for this one. And now we need to be able to actually show the score. But the way we're going to do that is not by bringing in an image, because the score can change, well, it will change every single time you rescue a civilian. So what we're going to actually do is draw some text inside of this sprite. And to do that, we need to create a font. So up here we have a group called font. I'm going to right click and create a new font. And I'm going to give this F and T as a prefix, and then we're going to call it score. So GameMaker has the ability to have custom fonts in here. You can choose from all of the built-in ones. You can install new fonts, and you can create as many as you want. So the font we're going to be using is called the Potzen 1 font. You can press P and look through. Now, it is not a built-in font to my system. I actually need to go and download it. How you do that is by finding the font you want, and in the description below, you'll find a link to the Potzen 1 font right here, or Potzen, however you want to pronounce it, I don't know. But click download, and then it's going to download it. On mine, it's going to save it, and then I can open it up, extract the file, and then once you have it here, you can double click on it, and you can click install. So this is actually going to install this font into my system. And then after you've installed it, you can come back into GameMaker, and what normally is required is a reset. So I'm going to go ahead and save my project, exit out of GameMaker, and then I'm going to reload GameMaker, and now it will have that font installed. I'll go load up my project again. We will go back into the font, press P, scroll down a little bit, and here is Potzen or Potzen 1. And that's how you install fonts, but you can use whichever font you want. We're going to change this size to 36, so it's a fair bit larger. And this is the font we're going to use for all of the scores that we show inside of our game. That's everything we need to do with the font, so I'm going to close out of that. I'm going to go into OBJ Player one more time. So in here, we need to create a variable that we have access for our score. And we want this to be accessible everywhere, because we're going to increase it here, and then we're going to draw it in a different object. So up until this point, we've used temporary variables, which are only available after you create them inside of that event. We've also used that Boolean variable called rescued, and that was available through the entire object. But now we need to create a global variable. And this is a variable that is accessible throughout all of your objects and all of your code at any time. Global variables are great for things like scores, things that we need to be able to have access in multiple different objects. Don't go too crazy with them though. Too many global variables can cause a lot of issues, because if one object is depending upon a global variable, and a different object just goes and changes it willy-nilly, it can cause your game to just completely crash. So keep that in mind. We're going to use one here because it is the best way of doing it, but don't just make all of your variables global. It's the best idea to keep your variables as local as possible. So use temporary whenever you can, then use regular instance, and then use global when necessary. So to create that, we're going to search for global, and we can set a global variable right here. This one is going to be called score rescue, and it's going to start with a value of 0. So now that we have this global variable, we can increase it whenever we rescue a civilian. So let's open up OBJ civilian, and when we collide with the player, all of this code gets run and we get rescued. So inside here, let's go ahead and search for global one more time. And this time we're going to actually set a global variable right under after we rescue them. So score underscore rescue is the variable we want. And we're going to set the value to 1, but we're going to click relative. So what that means is it's going to increase the value of this global variable by 1 every time we rescue a civilian. And now we're going to create a specific score object for keeping track and drawing everything related to the score. So in our objects, let's go ahead and right click, create a new object, and we're going to call this one obj underscore rescue. And now let's give this object our score sprite from our HUD. And this object is going to handle drawing the score onto the screen. And there's a special event for that called the draw event, and specifically just draw. Now, when you add this event, GameMaker does something kind of funny that, if you're not aware of it, can catch you off guard. Normally, your objects will draw the sprite that you have associated with them, as we've seen throughout everything we've done up until this point. But as soon as you add a draw event, GameMaker says, you want to handle it? Go right ahead. And it is no longer going to even draw the sprite associated with that object. Fortunately, there's a very easy fix for that. We just have to draw ourself. And there's a function, there's a code block right here called drawSelf. Drag that in, and now our HUD, our scorecard here, will get drawn exactly as expected. So now that we're sure our scorecard is being drawn, let's go ahead and draw the text that we want inside of it. But before we do that, we created a font, but in GameMaker you have to actually tell the object which font to use whenever you want to put some text onto the screen. So we want the set font code block, drag it inside of here. The font we want is font underscore score. There's a lot of scores being said right now. Then the primary code block we want to look at is called draw value. We're going to put this down here. And inside these quotes is what we can put as the caption. So the first part, so we're going to have rescued here, and we're going to do a space. And then the value that we want is that global variable. So global dot score underscore rescue. You can see the autocomplete came to the rescue there. Now we're going to have it at x and y 0, but we need them to both be relative based on this object. So we want to draw them right where we are, and our middle is right there in the center, which is exactly what we're looking for. So now what we're going to do is actually put this score object into our game. So we're going to make a new layer. Let's go ahead and rename this called HUD. And we want this to be on the very top of everything else. So then we're going to place it at the top left, right up here in the corner. And let's run our game and check it out, because now it should be showing our score. Oh, wait a minute, what's going on here? This is where we want it, but the text is way off. Now, if we rescue a civilian, does it work? Well, it does. It changes and increases our score as expected, but the font is not where it should be. Like, the text is way off. The reason for this is GameMaker has several different ways of choosing where to actually draw your text and your values at. So those are called the H align and V alignment, which stands for horizontal alignment and vertical alignment. So let's search for a code block called set text alignment. And so then drag the set text, and we would need to do it above where we're actually drawing the text at, because this is going to set the alignment for the text right here. Now in the manual, it has a visual example of all of the different options that we've got right here. The way it currently is set is to FA left and FA top. So that means that for the horizontal alignment, it's to the left right here, and for the vertical alignment, it's to the top. So our origin for our scorecard is right in the center, which is where we want it, and we want the text to be centered as well, like this right here. So we want the horizontal text to be centered, and we want the vertical text to be in the middle. So centered for horizontal, middle for vertical. It's taken me a very long time to make sure that I actually know which the center versus middle for horizontal versus vertical. So don't feel bad if that's really confusing, because it kind of is at first. But for now, just follow along. We're going to change this to FA underscore center, and we're going to change the V align to FA middle. Just make sure you spell middle right, otherwise you'll have an error there. Now, if we run this, our text is actually going to be exactly where we want it, which is perfect. But when you change this, when you call this code block once, it changes it for everything. So any other time that we draw text, we are going to need to either set it specifically there, or we can grab our code block here, and underneath here, just drag this right here, and then it will be set back to the default. That way you don't necessarily have to set the text alignment every other time you want to draw something. But for this one, it will work exactly how we want it to. So the rescuing of the civilians is the first score. Now let's add in a second score, and this is going to be for the height. How tall, how high can we get in this game? So let's go back to OBJ player. In the create event, this is where we made our global variable. We're going to click on this little plus icon to the left, which can be a little hard to see, but it gives us the ability to create another global variable. So I'm going to call this score underscore height. And again, this one's going to start at 0. And so this global variable will increase as we move up in the game. So in the step event here, let's go to set global. So this is what we want to use. At the very bottom here, we'll add it to this if variable check. And we're going to increase our global dot, and this is the score height. And we're going to give it a value of our down speed divided by 100, and we're going to make it relative. So remember that down speed is stored right here. We've got the variable down speed, and it's the opposite of our v speed. It goes all the way down here, but we're dividing it by 100. So essentially what we're doing is every 100 pixels our player climbs, we're going to give a score of 1. And so it's actually going to go up relatively quickly, but it's not dependent on hitting ledges, and it is dependent on actually moving up in the world. So to draw this score, we need another score object. So let's go ahead and right click on our OBJ rescue score, and we can duplicate this. And this time we're going to call it OBJ score height. And in that object, let's go ahead and go into it, open up the draw event. What we can do is just change what we're drawing. So instead of the rescued, we're going to put height. And then instead of the global.rescue score, it's going to be global.score height. Now, this is going to work, but it is going to do one strange thing. And that's because we're dividing our height score by 100 of our down speed. So it's actually going to come up with a decimal. And to show you this, let's go into our room, and I'm going to add the height score over here on the right-hand side. And if we run this, we will now have both scores functioning kind of as expected. So you can see that our height has a decimal spot inside of there. Now, if you like that, great. Keep it just the way it is. But for what I would like to do, I want to actually round that value to the nearest whole number. So inside of our draw value, we can use a rounding function called round. And to use a function like this inside of the value, what we're going to do is recall it with the name, and then open it up with a parenthetical mark or parentheses, which is Shift 9 on my keyboard, and then go to the very end and do Shift 0, and it closes that parentheses. So it's going to take the value of global.score height and round it to the nearest whole number. And so now when we run this, you'll see that it's no longer 1 point or 7 point, it is just 7, which is, in my opinion, much nicer. But again, your game, keep it exactly how you want. I'm just showing you how to use a function inside of the value, and a very useful one for rounding. And now the very last thing we're going to do is a really cool jump effect. So whenever we land on a ledge, we're going to create a sprite there, and it's going to propel us forward. It's going to look really, really cool. So let's first bring that sprite in. So let's go to Sprites, and we're going to put this in the player group because it is associated with the player. So I'm going to go and right click, create a sprite, and this one's going to be called SPR jump effect. So I'll go ahead and name it right now. And then I'm going to go to import, and under the animations folder, you'll find the jump effect. Now, one really cool thing that GameMaker can do is import a sprite strip, which is just one long image full of images, sub-images or frames. And if it has this number at the end and GameMaker can evenly divide it, then it's actually going to bring it in all separated and ready to be used. So if we open this up, you can see it opens it up as individual frames. And if we press play now, that is what it looks like. And I think that looks really, really cool. The only thing we need to do is change its origin to bottom center, because we're going to put it on the bottom of where the player is at. So after that, let's make a new object. We're going to call this obj jump effect. We can assign that sprite right to the object. And we need to also make the parent of this object the move object, because it's going to move down with the window that we created it on. If you don't do that, then it's going to like stay in midair and look really, really weird. So make sure you give it that parent there. Then we're going to go to add event, other, animation end. So when it is done playing, we're going to destroy it. So search for instance destroy, which is right here. And that's all we have to do is just drag that right in there, because it plays through, and when it's done, we don't need it anymore. You don't want to leave objects in your game that are not being used, because they still count as resources that GameMaker is having to manage. So anytime you're done with an object, get rid of it. So that's all done now. Let's go into OBJ player and get to the collision event with OBJ window here. And every time we collide, we're going to create this jump effect. So we're going to search for create instance, put it down here. So the instance we're going to create is under objects, and it's going to be obj jump effect. We're going to create it relative to our X position, but on the Y, we want to actually make it on the window we're colliding with, because remember, the window's origin is right on that ledge where we want it to be. So how we do that is by saying other.y. In this case, only in a collision event, we can say other. So other, in this case, refers to what we are colliding with. We are the player. We have a collision event with the window. So other is for that window. And we want to get their Y position. And then we're going to create it on the player layer. And that's everything we have to do. Let's go ahead and run it. And now you'll see that when we collide with that window, the collision effect gets created and it moves down along with everything else. So I think that looks really, really cool. And that's everything we're going to do for part 2. In the next part, we're going to start looking at how to spawn the fire obstacles, everything to do with them, including touching them, losing the game, how to shoot a foam to put out that fire, and we're going to start adding in some sound effects. So make sure you join me for part 3. And as I like to say, keep making, keep learning, and I'll talk to you later.